On the afternoon of Friday, the 7th of February, 2003, a 52-year-old woman named Monique Lunet was in her kitchen clearing away the plates from lunch. Her house was in a quiet suburb in Cunha, France, and it was the kind of place where not much ever happened. Her husband, Claude, and two of her adult sons, Frank and Pascal, were still sitting at the table talking amongst themselves. They were getting ready to leave for an overnight trip. The plan was to drive about 3.5 hours to a town near Paris for a big family gathering. It was a retirement party for Claude's sister-in-law, and it was supposed to be a happy occasion. But Monique wasn't going. She had told everyone that somebody needed to stay behind to look after their 4 dogs, and that was true. But there was another reason, a much bigger one, that she was staying home. She just really did not get along with her husband's side of the family. The whole situation was complicated. Monique and Claude had gotten married almost 20 years earlier. It was a second marriage for both of them, and they came into it with a lot of baggage, specifically a lot of kids. Monique had 3 boys from her first marriage, and Claude had 5 girls. At first, it was like a real-life Brady Bunch. The two halves of this new blended family seemed to get along just fine. But as time went on, things started to get tense. The personalities just didn't mesh, especially between Monique and her 5 new stepdaughters. When she and Claude had tied the knot, all 5 of his daughters were already teenagers or in their early 20s. So while they accepted Monique into their lives, they never really saw her as a mother figure. They were already very close with their own mother, Claude's ex-wife, a woman named Beatrice. To them, Beatrice was their mom, and Monique was just their dad's new wife. Then, about 10 years before, in 1993, something happened that completely shattered the fragile peace. One of Claude's grandsons, so the child of one of his daughters, had accused Monique's eldest son, Jean-Luc, of sexually abusing him. The accusation was never reported to the police, so there was no official investigation, no charges, nothing. It was just a family matter. But it was an explosive one. Claude's 5 daughters and his ex-wife Beatrice all completely believed the grandson. Monique, on the other hand, fiercely defended her son Jean-Luc. She was adamant that he would never do such a thing. Claude was caught in the middle, torn between his wife and his daughters. The fallout was ugly. It got so bad that the two sides of the family just stopped speaking to each other entirely for a whole year. Now, fast forward to 2003, and they were all back on speaking terms, but it was just that, speaking terms. The air was still thick with tension and resentment whenever they all got together. It was uncomfortable for everyone involved. And that was the real reason Monique wasn't going to the retirement party. It was also why her son, Jean-Luc, the one at the center of the old accusation, wasn't going either. It was just easier for everyone if they stayed away. So, around 3 in the afternoon, as Claude, Frank, and Pascal wheeled their suitcases out to the car, Monique followed them to the front door. She gave them each a hug and a kiss goodbye, told them to have fun, and then she stood in the doorway and watched as they got into the car and drove off down the street, leaving her alone in the quiet house with the dogs. A few hours passed. The sun started to set. Around 6:30 in the evening, Monique heard a knock on her front door. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened it, she saw her son, Jean-Luc, standing on the porch holding his bicycle. He told her he was just on his way home from work and decided to stop by for a quick visit. She was happy to see him and told him to come on in. Jean-Luc leaned his bike against the side of the house and walked inside. As he was taking off his coat in the hallway, he mentioned something to his mom. He said that as he was riding up to the house, he noticed their neighbor from across the street, a man named Henri, was staring at him. He said it was weird, like Henri was spying on him. This actually spooked Monique a little bit. Henri wasn't just a nosy neighbor. He was known in the neighborhood for being a bit of a loose cannon. He had this bizarre obsession with people parking in front of his house. If anyone dared to park their car on the public street in front of his property, Henri would shamelessly vandalize it. He'd slash their tires or pour oil all over the car. He just didn't care who saw him do it. Over the years, Monique and her sons had gotten into several screaming matches with Henri over parking. One of those arguments had even turned into a full-blown physical fight. So the idea of him watching the house was unsettling. But since Jean-Luc had come on his bike and there was no car to trigger Henri's rage, Monique just hoped he would leave them alone. She led Jean-Luc into the kitchen and poured them both a glass of sparkling wine. They sat at the kitchen table and just chatted for about half an hour, catching up on things. After they finished their drinks, Monique offered to give him a haircut, so he sat in a chair while she trimmed his hair, just a normal, quiet mother-son evening. Around 7:05, Jean-Luc said he had to get going. His wife was waiting for him at their apartment for dinner. He gave his mom a hug, said goodbye, and went back outside. He grabbed his bike, which thankfully was still untouched by Henri, got on, and rode off into the evening. After he was gone, Monique went about her routine. She gathered the 4 dogs and put them behind a baby gate they kept at the bottom of the staircase to keep them contained. She filled their bowls with food, and then she went back into the kitchen to start cooking dinner for herself. A little while later, around 7:30, she heard another knock at the front door. She knew it couldn't be Jean-Luc again. As she walked down the long hallway to answer it, she had a knot in her stomach, just hoping it wasn't Henri, ready to start another argument. The next morning, the woman who lived in the house right next door to Monique woke up feeling groggy and tired. She hadn't slept well at all. All night long, some dogs in the neighborhood had been barking non-stop, and it had kept her up. She got out of bed and walked over to her bedroom window, pulling open the blinds. Sunlight flooded into the room, making her squint. As her eyes adjusted, she glanced down from her second-floor window into the yard of the 2-story white house next door, Monique's house. And that's when she saw something. There was a dark shape lying in the middle of the paved walkway that led up to Monique's front door. It looked out of place. The neighbor pressed her face against the glass, squinting to get a better look. And then her heart stopped. She realized what she was seeing. It was a body, lying face down on the pavement. In a total panic, the woman stumbled back from the window, ran out of her room, grabbed the phone, and frantically dialed the police. A couple of hours later, Judiciary Police Captain Ann P. pulled her car up in front of the white 2-story house. The street was already blocked off with crime scene tape, and a medical examiner's van was parked out front. As Captain P got out of her car, another officer approached her and led her toward the front yard, to where the body of a woman was still lying on the walkway. The officer explained that the victim was Monique Loon, and she had been found just like this by her neighbor earlier that morning. Based on the progression of rigor mortis, the medical examiner had given a preliminary estimate for the time of death, sometime between 8 o'clock and midnight the night before. Captain P crouched down to get a closer look at the body. But even from a distance, she could tell that the victim had suffered absolutely gruesome injuries. There was blood all over Monique's face and clothes. Her torso looked like it had been completely torn apart by what were clearly stab wounds. Just from a quick visual assessment, P guessed the woman had been stabbed at least a dozen times, maybe more. She also noticed something else right away. There were obvious defense wounds all over Monique's hands and forearms. This told her 2 things. First, this was definitely a murder. And second, Monique had put up a very, very serious fight against her attacker. After a few more moments of observing the body, P stood back up. She asked the officer if any of the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual the previous night. The officer shook his head and said, "No, not really." The only thing anyone had mentioned was that Monique's 4 dogs had been barking non-stop for most of the night, starting at around 8 o'clock. P nodded, making a mental note of that. Then she walked over to the front door of the house to check for signs of forced entry. The door was closed. She examined the frame and the lock, but saw nothing. No splintered wood, no pry marks. But as she scanned the area, she did see a faint, bloody handprint on the exterior wall, right next to the door. P carefully turned the handle, which was unlocked, and opened the door. The sight that greeted her was chilling. The hallway just inside the entrance was a horrific scene, absolutely covered in blood. There were splatters on the walls, pools on the floor. It was clear that a violent struggle had taken place right there. P stepped inside, being extremely careful not to contaminate the scene, her eyes scanning every detail. She walked slowly down the hallway, peering into the other rooms. She noticed that the vast majority of the blood was contained to the entryway. This reinforced her initial theory. The attack on Monique had likely started and ended right here, in this hallway. Her working theory began to form. Someone had knocked on the door. Monique had opened it, and her attacker had launched their assault immediately. But then, as P stepped back outside and looked down at the front walkway again, she noticed something that just didn't add up. Despite the massive amount of blood inside the house right by the door, there was absolutely no blood on the walkway between the door and the spot where Monique's body was found. Not a single drop. Given how much blood Monique had clearly lost inside, P found it highly unlikely that she would have been able to run all the way out into the yard after the attack. So, she started to wonder if perhaps the body had been moved after she died. Monique was a large woman. If her killer had not only been able to overpower her in a fight, but also carry or drag her body that distance, P had to assume that the killer was likely very strong. In her mind, the profile of the suspect was starting to solidify. She was looking for a big, strong man. But what she couldn't figure out was the motive for moving the body. Why would a killer risk being seen dragging a corpse out into the front yard where any neighbor could look out their window and see them? It didn't make sense. Unless, for some bizarre reason, they wanted Monique's body to be found as quickly as possible. And since it seemed that Monique had willingly opened the door for her killer, P was almost certain that it had to be someone she knew. Around noon on that same day, Saturday, February 8th, Captain P was about to head next door to speak with Monique's neighbor herself when a car suddenly pulled up to the curb. 3 men got out. They looked utterly shocked and deeply concerned as they stared at the police cars and the crime scene tape surrounding the house. By now, P had learned from the neighbors that Monique had a husband and several adult sons. She immediately assumed that these must be them, returning from their trip. So she quickly walked down the walkway to intercept them, to keep them from walking into the active crime scene. The 3 men, who were indeed Monique's husband Claude and her sons Frank and Pascal, rushed towards her. They crowded around her, their voices filled with panic, asking what was going on, where was Monique, what had happened. P had to deliver the terrible news. She told them, as gently as she could, that Monique had been stabbed to death. For a moment, all 3 of them just stood there in complete silence, the words hanging in the air. Then, one of the sons broke down and just started to cry. P explained that they couldn't go inside the house because it was still being processed for evidence. Instead, she led them over to the curb, away from the scene, and they all sat down. She could see the men were in a state of profound shock. Even though one son was crying, it was like the other 2 couldn't even process the reality of what she had just told them. But as difficult as it was, she needed to ask them questions while the details were still fresh. She pulled out a notepad and gently asked them about the last time they had seen Monique. Claude told her that they had all left the house around 3 o'clock the previous afternoon, leaving Monique at home by herself. He explained they had gone to the family gathering near Paris, stayed the night, and had only just gotten back into town moments ago. They had seen the police presence and had no idea what was going on. P then asked Claude to give her the names of everyone in their family, all the adult children from both sides, Claude's ex-wife, Monique's ex-husband, everybody. As Claude listed the names, he made a point to tell her that he just couldn't imagine anyone in their family being capable of something like this. P nodded understandingly, but she knew from experience that family members were often the first people to look at. She didn't say that, of course. Instead, she just asked, "Can you think of anyone at all who would want to hurt Monique?" Claude thought for a long moment and then shook his head. He said no, she lived a pretty normal, uneventful life. But then, one of the sons spoke up. He said that actually, there might be someone. He said, her neighbor, Henri, and he pointed across the street to the house directly opposite Monique's. A minute later, Captain P was knocking on Henri's front door. After a few seconds, a middle-aged man opened it. He looked out at the commotion across the street with a curious expression. P introduced herself and told him that his neighbor, Monique, had been murdered. And when she said that, Henri smiled. It was a small, subtle smile, but it was unmistakable. Immediately, alarm bells started ringing in Captain P's head. This man was acting incredibly suspicious. She asked him if she could come in and look around. Henri didn't seem surprised by the request at all, almost as if he was expecting to be a suspect. He just said, "Sure, come on in," and stepped aside. P entered the house and began a thorough search of every room. She went through the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. But despite looking everywhere, she found no traces of blood, no recently cleaned areas, nothing at all that seemed suspicious or out of place. Eventually, she made her way back to the living room where Henri was waiting. She asked him where he was the previous evening. He told her very casually that he and his wife were right here at home. P thought it was a pretty weak alibi, just his wife's word against the world, but she made a mental note to follow up with the wife later to confirm his story. Next, P asked Henri if he had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary the night before. And Henri said, no, not really. Except, he added, that around 7 o'clock, he had seen one of Monique's sons leaving her house on his bicycle. At this, P's attention sharpened. The family had already told her that Monique had a third adult son, Jean-Luc, who had not gone to the party in Paris. If Henri was telling the truth, it meant that Jean-Luc was very likely the last person to see his mother alive. And that made him a prime suspect. Maybe he was even the killer. The next morning, Captain P led a forensics team up the stairs of a rundown apartment building in a sketchier part of town. She knocked on the door to Jean-Luc's apartment. A moment later, a young man answered. After confirming his identity, 2 officers escorted a confused-looking Jean-Luc away to be questioned down at the station. Meanwhile, P and the forensics team went inside to search the apartment. It didn't take long to find something. As P was walking through the living room, one of the officers called her over. He had his flashlight out and was pointing the beam at a spot on the wall. When P got closer, she could see what he was highlighting. There were several tiny dark red droplets splattered on the paint. P pulled out her own flashlight and started her own search. She scoured the walls and the floor near the staircase, looking for any more signs of blood. And she found a few more red droplets near the doorknob of a closet. She opened the closet door. Inside, leaning against the back wall, was a bicycle. She shined her flashlight all over the bike, on the wheels, the frame, the pedals, and she saw it. The underside of the bike was covered in reddish-brown splatters, as if whoever had ridden it last had cycled right through a puddle of blood. An hour later, Captain P walked into an interrogation room at the police station. Jean-Luc was sitting at the table, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his face a mask of fear and confusion. P sat down across from him and got straight to the point. She asked him what he had been doing at his mother's house on the night of February 7th. Jean-Luc explained that he had just stopped by for a visit after work, something he did often. He said he only stayed for about half an hour before he rode his bike back home. When P asked him if he had gone straight home after leaving his mother's, Jean-Luc said no, he hadn't. He explained that his wife's brother, a man named Christophe Gracier, lived in the same apartment building, on the floor right below them. He said that before going up to his own apartment, he stopped by Christophe's place for a few minutes to chat. After that, he claimed he spent the rest of the night in his own apartment with his wife. To Captain P, it felt like he was leaving something out. They had found what looked like blood in his apartment and all over his bike. She felt that if she just pushed him a little harder, his story might start to unravel. So she told him, point blank, that they had found blood in his living room and that it was being sent to the lab for analysis. When Jean-Luc heard this, his face went bright red. He started stammering, trying to explain it away. He said the blood was probably from a neighbor who had cut himself while visiting a few days earlier. P just nodded, her expression unreadable. Then she told him about the blood they'd found all over his bike. At this, Jean-Luc hesitated. He stuttered and stammered, but couldn't come up with any plausible explanation for that. At this point, P felt like she had him cornered. She told him to be quiet for a moment and to roll up his sleeves so she could see his arms. P knew that based on the extensive defensive wounds on Monique's body, her attacker must have some marks on them. She was sure Monique had fought back hard and had likely left at least a few scrapes or bruises on her killer. But when Jean-Luc slowly rolled up his sleeves, P saw nothing. Not a single scratch, not a single bruise on his hands or his arms. It was clean. A few minutes later, P left the interrogation room and walked back to her office. Despite the lack of defensive wounds on his arms, Jean-Luc's behavior was extremely suspicious, and she wasn't ready to let him go just yet. But she also knew she couldn't afford to get tunnel vision. She had to consider other possibilities, just in case the blood in his apartment turned out to be a dead end. She sat down at her desk, opened the case file, and began flipping through the notes from interviews her team had already conducted with the rest of Monique's family and neighbors. Monique's other sons had mentioned the tension between their mother and her 5 stepdaughters. But officers had already spoken to all of the stepdaughters and their husbands, and while some of the women admitted they still had issues with Monique, every single one of them, and their husbands, had solid alibis for the night of the murder. Several family members had also brought up Claude's ex-wife, Beatrice, mentioning that she and Monique definitely did not get along. But officers had tracked down Beatrice, and she just didn't seem like a viable suspect. Beatrice had told them that for the most part, she and Monique just stayed out of each other's way. She said they hadn't even seen each other in over a month. And physically, she seemed an impossible fit for the crime. Beatrice was remarkably tiny and frail. She was 58 years old, barely 4'9", and looked incredibly weak. It seemed almost impossible that she could have overpowered the much larger and stronger Monique, inflicted those horrific injuries, and then dragged her body out to the front yard. It just didn't seem physically possible. So, while she wasn't officially ruled out, she was very low on the list of suspects. Just then, there was a knock on Captain P's office door. She looked up and saw another officer standing there. He told her there were 2 people in the station who wanted to speak with her about the case. P nodded, and a moment later, a nervous-looking middle-aged man and woman walked into her office. They sat down across the desk from her, and the man said they had information that might help with the Monique Lunet investigation. P sat up straight, grabbed a notepad, and said, "Okay, tell me what you have." She began writing as the man explained that he was a co-worker of Christophe Gracier. P immediately recognized the name. That was Jean-Luc's brother-in-law, the person Jean-Luc claimed he had visited on the night of the murder, right after leaving Monique's house. The man sitting across from her said that just a few hours ago, he'd gotten a phone call from Christophe's number. But when he answered it, all he could hear was a muffled conversation between 2 women in the background. At first, the man thought it was just a pocket dial, maybe Christophe's kid playing with the phone. But he said that when he put his phone on speaker, he and his wife, the woman sitting next to him, both started listening very closely. And they were able to make out bits and pieces of the conversation. The 2 women on the line were clearly talking about needing an alibi, and they said something about a man named Jean-Luc. The couple said they heard one of the women say something like, "It's not Jean-Luc's fault, he's depressed." And then they mentioned something about a pair of pants that needed to be washed. Captain P could hardly believe what she was hearing. Any lingering doubts she might have had about Jean-Luc being the killer pretty much vanished in that moment. This sounded like a cover-up. She took down the couple's names and contact information, showed them out of her office, and as soon as they were gone, she grabbed her keys. She was heading straight for Christophe's apartment. By this point, Christoph had already been brought in for questioning, and he had completely denied knowing anything about Monique's murder or the strange phone call that was supposedly made from his number. But P hoped that a search of his apartment might tell a different story. She walked through each room of the apartment until she found the laundry area. She put on a pair of latex gloves, opened the washing machine, and reached inside. She pulled out a pair of men's pants. They were still damp, as if they had just been washed that day. She held the pants up to the light and saw a distinct brownish stain on one of the legs. She also noticed that the pants looked like they would be way too small for Christoph, who was a tall, burly man. But they looked like they would be a perfect fit for a smaller guy, a guy like Jean-Luc. Later that same day, which was now Monday, February 10th, just 2 days after Monique's body was found, Captain P was back in her office when her phone rang. She answered it. It was a technician from the crime lab. He told her they already had the preliminary results from the samples that had been sent in for testing. P braced herself, ready for the news that would hopefully seal the case against Jean-Luc. But what the technician told her was the exact opposite of what she expected. He said that the stains on the bicycle were indeed blood, but it was animal blood. He went on to say that the other little droplets of blood found in Jean-Luc's apartment, the ones on the walls and near the closet door, were human blood, but they were not a match for Monique. And then, the final blow. Those pants they had found in the washing machine? The brownish stain wasn't blood at all. It was just grease. Captain P was incredibly frustrated. In her mind, she had been so sure about Jean-Luc. It really seemed like he was their guy. But now, all the physical evidence against him had evaporated into thin air. As for that bizarre phone call to Christoph's coworker, they had no way of knowing who the two women in the background were, or if the coworker and his wife had even heard the conversation correctly. Maybe they had misheard the part about the alibi and Jean-Luc being depressed. P thanked the lab technician for the update, as disappointing as it was, and was about to hang up. But then he told her to wait, that he had one more piece of news for her. He told her that during Monique's autopsy, the medical examiner had found something significant. There was DNA under Monique's fingernails. It was very likely skin cells from her killer that had been scratched off during the struggle. The technician said it would take at least a few more weeks to get a full analysis. But once the results came back, they could definitely test it against DNA samples from any of their suspects. And maybe, just maybe, they would get a match. This gave P a renewed sense of hope. After she hung up the phone, she started making a list of everyone they would need to get a DNA sample from. At the top of the list were Jean-Luc and Christoph. And then there was the neighbor, Henri. He still seemed like a strong suspect to her. P had spoken to Henri's wife, who had confirmed his alibi, claiming they were together the whole night Monique was killed. But she knew that spouses often lied for each other, so she didn't put much stock in it. So, at this point, P felt she had 3 decent potential suspects to get DNA from. But that was it. The rest of Monique's family had been ruled out. None of the other neighbors seemed suspicious. And by all accounts, Monique lived a quiet suburban life and didn't really have any other enemies. P had a nagging feeling that something was missing, that there was a piece of the puzzle she just wasn't seeing. She decided that in the time she had while waiting for the DNA results, she was going to find it. Over the next few weeks, that's exactly what Captain P did. She pored over all the evidence they had collected, reading every report, looking at every photo. She re-interviewed all the family members and spoke to all the neighbors again. But despite this huge effort, nothing new came up. No new suspects emerged. Then, in early March, about 4 weeks after that first call, P got another call from the crime lab. The technician on the line told her that the DNA analysis had come back. And he said that even before they tested it against any of their specific suspects, the results were already enough to narrow down the field significantly. And when Captain P heard what the technician had to say, she realized that this was it. This was the missing piece of information she had been searching for all along. Based on this revelatory DNA evidence and an eventual confession from the killer, this is what police believe happened to Monique Lunet on the night of the 7th of February, 2003. The killer walked up to Monique's front door and knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened, and Monique was standing there. But instead of inviting her visitor inside, Monique just stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression cold. The killer began to speak, attempting to have a conversation. But what was supposed to be a civil discussion quickly escalated into a heated argument. Both of them started hurling insults back and forth. At some point, Monique had enough. She slammed the door right in the killer's face. But just before she did, she said one last thing, something so inflammatory that it pushed the killer completely over the edge. Without even stopping to think about what they were doing, the killer, furious and rejected, stormed over to their vehicle, which was parked nearby. They reached under the driver's seat and grabbed a knife they kept there for self-defense. They marched right back to the front door, the knife clutched in their hand, and knocked again. As soon as Monique opened the door a second time, the killer pushed their way inside. And with a surge of uncontrollable rage, they just started stabbing her. But Monique was a strong woman, and she fought back with everything she had. She managed to knock the killer to the ground and actually pin them there. The killer, however, managed to wrestle the arm holding the knife free and continued the attack. It was an epic, violent struggle. And the whole time this was happening, Monique's 4 dogs were just on the other side of the baby gate at the base of the stairs, barking madly at the chaos unfolding in the entryway. Monique was screaming, a mixture of rage and panic and pain. Finally, the killer was able to break free from Monique's grip. They scrambled to their feet, turned, and bolted out of the house. The killer ran across the yard, jumped in their vehicle, and started to drive away. But as they pulled away from the curb, they looked back and saw Monique stumble out of the front door. She took a few unsteady steps down the walkway, and then she collapsed to the ground. But the killer didn't wait around to see if she was dead. They just sped away. They drove to a nearby supermarket parking lot and threw the murder weapon, the knife, into a public trash can. Then, the killer went home and burned their blood-stained clothes in their stove, believing that would be enough to destroy any evidence linking them to this horrific crime. They thought they were safe, especially since they knew they were the last person anyone would ever suspect of such a violent murder. It would turn out the killer was the 4-foot 9-inch tall, tiny, frail Beatrice Matisse, Claude's 8-year-old ex-wife. In her confession to police, she claimed she had gone to Monique's house that night to finally try and bury the hatchet after all the years of feuding between the two sides of the family. But she said the bad blood just ran too deep. And when Monique apparently insulted Beatrice's daughters, that was the final inflammatory line she'd shouted before slamming the door. Beatrice said she just snapped. Beatrice had been ruled out as a suspect early on, primarily because of her small size. It seemed impossible that she could have committed such a brutal act. The police theory had been that the body was moved, which would have required a lot of strength. But it turned out Monique's body wasn't moved at all. She had stumbled out there herself. She was apparently so full of adrenaline after the attack that she had managed to chase Beatrice out of the house before she finally collapsed and died. And she did that after being stabbed over 50 times and losing a massive amount of blood. Because Monique had fought back so fiercely, she had managed to get traces of Beatrice's DNA under her fingernails. And so, the DNA analysis came back and immediately showed that the killer was a woman. Further testing eventually confirmed that it was a match for Beatrice. As for the strange phone call, investigators never figured out for sure who made it. But their best guess was that the women heard in the background were Christophe's mother and sister, and it was just an innocent conversation about Monique's murder that the coworker had simply misunderstood and misinterpreted. Beatrice Matisse was arrested on the 29th of March 2003. She confessed to the murder immediately, though she later tried to take back her confession. She was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. It was a tragic end to years of simmering family hatred, a conflict that finally boiled over in a moment of unimaginable violence, all because of a quiet woman who nobody ever thought was capable of it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. The arrival of a police officer by the name of Guo Hu Wen occurred a few minutes after the initial call was placed. Several emergency medical technicians and a small team of additional officers joined him at that moment. The area was devoid of noise and darkness, with the only source of illumination being the flashing red and blue lights of their cars. The emergency medical technicians were the first to approach the gray automobile, and they soon confirmed what everyone else who was there at the incident already knew. She had passed away while she was inside the vehicle. It was instantly apparent to the authorities that the wound was caused by a bullet because it was a small circular wound that was located directly below her left ear. In order to protect any potential evidence, Officer Guo gave his troops the instruction to seal the area and draw up a perimeter with yellow tape. His crew and he started their inquiry as soon as the cordon was put in place. The very first thing that Guo did was examine the body of the woman in further detail, attempting to piece together the events that transpired up until her death. It appeared as though she had just pulled over as she was still sitting erect in the driver's seat. After looking around, he noticed a single bullet casing lying on the ground just outside the open door on the driver's side. From the inside of the vehicle, he was able to make out what appeared to be small pieces of shining metal, similar to copper particles that had been shot out of a round. Nevertheless, there was not a single gun in sight anywhere. Officer Guo and his colleagues were aware that they were faced with a murder at this point in time. However, as he stood there, taking everything in, looking at the car, the body, and the length of highway that was completely deserted, he began to grasp the idea that the entire site appeared to be strange. To begin, he examined the terrain that was located behind the tires of the vehicle. There were no skid marks to be found. Consequently, this indicated that the woman must have made a controlled and deliberate decision to pull over. She hadn't been pushed off the road by another vehicle, to the best of our knowledge. In the second place, the glass on the driver's side of her vehicle was completely lowered. This didn't make any sense. It is possible that she had been driving with it down from the beginning, or that she had rolled it down after she had stopped without any problems. A third point to consider is that there was not the slightest indication of a battle. Before she was shot, there was no indication that this woman had been in any way comatose or terrified of anything. There was no evidence that her phone had fallen to the ground, rather it was still positioned on the passenger seat. Despite the fact that she had not even unbuckled her seatbelt. In general, it appeared as though this woman had been unexpectedly peaceful in her closing moments, as if she had no notion that she was about to be put to death. Officer Guo was led to believe that the person who shot her was most likely someone she knew as a result of this. In the middle of the night, on a highway that was completely empty, she rolled down her window for someone she trusted enough to do for her. So Guo was aware that the first thing he needed to do was to identify this woman, and then he needed to determine who was their closest friend. It was going to be run through the system to determine who the owner of the car was when he took down the license plate number of the vehicle. Just at that moment, however, another cop approached him while displaying a perplexed expression. Guo was informed by the officer that they had discovered anything peculiar inside the vehicle. In the storage pocket on the driver's side door, they discovered 4 small shreds of paper. As to whether or not this was connected to the crime, they were unsure. On each scrap, there were what appeared to be small pieces of words or figures that were scrawled. The shards had the letters 65, Dalo, Z, and Da written on them. It appeared that none of these pieces on their own had any significance. They appeared to have been torn from a bigger sheet of paper where they had been contained. The words were little more than fragments of words. They were not whole thoughts. The police attempted to arrange the four parts in a variety of various ways in order to determine whether or not they might make a coherent message. However, their efforts were fruitless. Every single thing was utterly absurd. Based on his observations, Officer Guo concluded that the fragments were most likely nothing more than junk that had been sitting in the vehicle for some time. However, as a precautionary measure, he instructed his officers to gather them up and submit them as evidence. It was impossible to predict what may become significant in the future. Officer Guo and a member of his team entered a huge housing complex in New Taipei City a few hours later. The complex was located to the north of the city. The location where they had discovered the woman in the gray sedan earlier that morning was approximately 40 miles away from where they were now. On their way to a particular apartment, they rode an elevator to the top floor and knocked on the door. The door was opened by a man of middle age after a brief duration. When he saw two law enforcement officers standing at his door, he appeared highly surprised and a little anxious. It was Officer Guo who inquired of the individual whether his name was Shu Bi Chung, to which the man responded with a nod and a yes, it was. In this point in time, Guo and his team had successfully identified the victim of the murder. She was 43 years old and went by the name of Hua Si. She lived in this very apartment with her 3 children and the man who had just opened the door, Shu Bi Chung, according to the information that they discovered when they began investigating her personal life. This was the first peculiar aspect of her life. Shu had been her ex-husband from the beginning. The couple had made the decision to continue living together in order to co-parent their children, despite the fact that they had divorced 5 years back. Due to the fact that he was Hua's ex-husband, Shu was an obvious person of interest in the murder of Hua. Nevertheless, Officer Guo was uncertain about what Shu knew at this point or whether he knew anything at all on the subject. Therefore, it was necessary for him to exercise caution in the manner in which he approached the conversation. To begin, Officer Guo introduced himself and his partner to the audience. After that, he inquired of Shu whether or not he had met with his ex-wife in recent times. According to Shu, he had not communicated with her since the previous evening, and he indicated his disagreement by shaking his head. On the other hand, he stated that their most recent conversation had been exceptionally peculiar. I was informed by Shu that Hua had left their apartment the night before at approximately 8:45 p.m. On the opposite side of the city, she was supposed to be attending a meeting with the proprietor of a pawn shop. In his statement, he stated that she owed a significant amount of money to the proprietor of the pawn shop and that they were supposed to be discussing a repayment plan. Nevertheless, Shu informed him that Hua had called him at approximately 9:30 p.m. while she was on her way to join this meeting. When she told him that she was on Highway 61, she also mentioned that another vehicle was following her. It was Shu who informed the officers that he had attempted to calm her down. It was probably just somebody driving the same route as her, he told her, and then he assured her that there was no reason to be concerned about it. First, he stated that Hua appeared to be in agreement, and then he hung up the phone. In order to check on Hua, he reportedly attempted to call her again a short while later, but she did not pick up the phone. He continued to try, according to Shu. He claimed that he called her 10 more times after that, but she never answered her phone again. In point of fact, he claimed that she never acknowledged his calls. As a result, Shu disclosed to the officers that he was unaware of the circumstances surrounding his ex-wife. Whether or not she ever showed up for the meeting was a mystery to him. He was unaware of her current location at the time. When Officer Guo first heard this story, his initial reaction was one of not believing what he was hearing. The entire tale seemed completely ridiculous to me. If Shu had genuine knowledge that Hua was possibly being followed on a dark highway, at night, by herself, while she was on her way to a high-stakes meeting with a person to whom she owed money, and then she suddenly stopped answering her phone, then she would have been able to prevent Ha from being followed. What on earth could have prevented him from calling the authorities? Have you, at the very least, made an effort to go and look for her? Instead, he simply put in a number of calls to her, and when she did not pick up, he simply shrugged it off and continued on with his night. In spite of the fact that the mother of his 3 children was in a potentially dangerous situation, he did nothing. A person's reaction seemed to be quite peculiar to me at the time. Since this was the case, Officer Guo kept a close eye on Shu as he broke the unfortunate news. He apologized profusely to him, but they had discovered his ex-wife early that morning. He told him he was very sorry. Inside her vehicle, which was parked on the shoulder of the road, she had been brutally murdered. This caused Shu's eyes to widen in response to what he heard. Suddenly, he started shaking, and he appeared to be completely taken aback. It appeared to Guo as though he was experiencing a genuine reaction of shock, as if he was unable to believe what he was hearing. As a result of Guo's extensive experience as a law enforcement officer, he was unable to be certain. The man's expression of grief was so convincing that he was unable to determine whether it was genuine or whether it was just an act. No matter what happened, Guo was aware of the next step he needed to take. He was required to investigate each and every aspect of Shu's story in order to determine whether or not he could discover any gaps in it. Guo and his team asked the manager of the apartment complex for any surveillance footage that was available from the previous night. This request was made after the interview had concluded. At the time that Shu claimed that Hua had left the apartment, they wanted to verify whether or not she had actually left. Additionally, the manager was able to retrieve some footage from a camera that was located inside the elevator of the building. The video did, in fact, demonstrate that Hua left at approximately 8:45 p.m., as Shu had asserted, but it also demonstrated something else that Officer Guo found to be extremely peculiar. In the video, Hua is seen entering the elevator, and it is assumed that she is on her way to meet with the proprietor of the pawn shop. However, she was not by herself. Her former husband, Shu, was riding in the elevator with her at the time. And while they were on the way down, Shu leaned in close to Hua and kissed her thoroughly for a full 8 seconds. Following that, he gave her a bear hug until the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened there. From the outside, this may appear to be nothing more than a typical tender moment shared by a couple who are deeply in love with one another. On the other hand, it was quite peculiar in this particular instance for 2 distinct reasons. Initially, Hua and Shu went through with a divorce. As far as Guo was aware, they were no longer a romantic couple despite their previous relationship. They were merely co-parents of the child. Furthermore, it was peculiar because in Taiwanese culture, public displays of affection are extremely rare, particularly among the older generations. This was a particularly peculiar aspect of the situation. Outside of their own home, it would be extremely unusual for a couple in their middle years to passionately embrace and kiss one another in such a public setting. The only explanation that made sense to Officer Guo for why Shu would act in such a manner while riding the elevator was if he was aware that something terrible was going to take place to his ex-wife. Instead of appearing to be a passionate kiss, it appeared to be a farewell kiss from the beginning. They discovered additional issues with Shu's account as the investigation progressed further. According to what they discovered, the proprietor of the pawn shop did in fact exist, and Hua did in fact owe him a significant amount of money. However, when the police were able to locate him and speak with him, he stated that he was completely incapable of understanding what they were discussing. He stated that he had not intended to meet with Hua on the evening of her passing, despite his previous intentions. Not a single meeting took place. A surveillance video from Highway 61, which was the road where Hua's body was discovered, was also able to be accessed by the police. It is true that the cameras did not cover the precise location where the murder took place. However, they did record footage of Hua's car driving along the highway at 9:30 p.m., which is the exact time that Shu stated she had called him to tell him that she was being followed. The video, however, makes it abundantly clear that there was no other vehicle following Hua. It was just her driving by herself. Officer Guo believed that it was much more likely that Shu was the one who was lying now, making up the story about the car following his ex-wife in order to create a false lead for the police. Although it was technically possible that Ha had lied to her ex-husband for some unknown reason, Officer Guo believed that it was much more likely that Shu was what was lying. As soon as Officer Guo and his team were aware of all of this information, they returned to the apartment complex and re-examined all of the surveillance footage stored there. To determine whether or not they were able to follow Shu's movements on the night of the murder, they also obtained a warrant for the records of his mobile phone, which included his GPS data. However, the reality that they discovered only made matters more complicated. It appears that Shu had been inside his apartment throughout the entire night, as evidenced by the surveillance footage from the building as well as the pings from his cell phone. After he had finished saying his goodbyes to Hua in the elevator, he went back upstairs and remained there until he left. The possibility that he was the one who personally drove out to Highway 61 and shot Hua was completely out of the question. According to Officer Guo, however, this did not imply that Shu was innocent. Only the theory was altered as a result. One of the things that he pondered was whether or not Shu had hired someone to carry out the murder on his behalf. Even though he did not have any evidence, he had a strong feeling that Shu had to be involved in some way no matter what. However, that theory did not provide sufficient answers to a great deal of questions. To put it another way, why would Shu have wanted Hua to disappear in the first place? Why would Hua have been so calm to pull over and open her car window for a total stranger if it turned out that the person she was about to kill was a hired killer? That didn't make any sense. After giving it some thought for a short period of time, Officer Guo eventually came up with an idea. It's possible that the person Shu hired wasn't a complete stranger. Perhaps the assassin was someone that Hua was familiar with and trusted. A number of months had passed. Officer Guo and one of his friends were now occupying a comfortable office located in a high-rise building in New Taipei City while they were chatting. They were seated atop a massive desk that had been meticulously polished. One of the individuals that worked in this workplace was seated behind the desk. One of Hua's brothers, he was. Officer Guo and his colleagues continued to operate under the assumption that the individual who had carried out the murder of Hua was most likely acquainted with her. Over the course of the past few months, they had spent their time painstakingly searching for and conducting interviews with each and every individual on her roster of cell phone contacts. In spite of the fact that they had not discovered any fresh suspects as of yet, they had discovered some highly interesting information regarding Hua's life. According to the evidence, Hua had not just been in debt to the proprietor of that one-pawn business. In addition, she owed money to a number of different banks, several friends, and even members of her own family. In addition to this, they found out that she owed money to a number of very dodgy black market lenders. All things considered, she had racked up a debt that was about comparable to $500,000 in United States currency. Furthermore, in light of this information, the connection between Hua and her ex-husband Shu became somewhat more comprehensible. The reason that Hua and Shu had split was not because they had lost affection for one another, according to a number of people who had shared their thoughts with Guo. Because of all of this debt, Hua's credit was so awful that Shu wanted to legally separate his finances from hers in order to protect himself. This was done for the purpose of protecting himself. According to all accounts, the couple, despite the fact that they had officially divorced, continued to be deeply in love with one another and were entirely devoted to both their children and to each other. Officer Guo and his squad were left feeling a little disoriented as a result of this new information. Despite the fact that Shu had first given off a very suspicious vibe, Guo did not have any concrete evidence that connected him to the crime. At this point, it appeared as though he did not even have a clear motive. At this point, Guo was sitting in this luxurious office directly across from Hua's brother, and all he could do was hope that some new piece of information, or any piece of information at all, would show up. Guo and his partner approached the brother and requested that he supply them with all of the information that he possessed regarding Hua, including her marriage, her debts, and anything else that he believed would be pertinent to her passing. The brother gave a slight nod and then began to speak. The things that he was saying, however, seemed to sound a lot like the other stories that Guo had already heard. This became apparent quite soon. He discussed the difficulties she was having financially, as well as her relationship with Shu. The knowledge was not brand new. They had heard this narrative again and again, and it was the same one. Therefore, as the brother continued to speak, Guo's attention began to wander away from what he was saying. His eyes started to travel around the apartment, taking in the view of the city as well as the beautiful furnishings that was there. After some time had passed, Guo's attention was drawn to a bookcase that was situated behind the brother's desk. Also, he observed that there was a single piece of paper that was protruding from the space between two books that were stored on the shelf. Even though Guo could only see a small portion of it at this moment, he was able to determine that the paper contained handwriting based on what he could see. In addition, the penmanship appeared to be familiar. Consequently, Guo silently stood up from his chair without making any noise, while the brother was still in the middle of telling a sentence. As he made his way around the large desk to the bookcase, he removed the piece of paper that he had been looking for. And the moment he laid eyes on it, his heart started beating extremely fast. Instantaneously, he recognized that the handwriting on this piece of paper was identical to the handwriting that was found on the 4 small scraps of paper that they had discovered at the scene of the crime. The very same leftovers that they had in the past, considered to be garbage. It wasn't only the penmanship that was the problem, though. Upon closer inspection, Guo noticed that the real words, or bits of words, as well as the number that was written on those fragments, were literally written on this piece of paper. When he looked at the document that Hua had torn up, he understood that he was looking at a complete copy of the document that had been in her car. When he first started, he had only 4 insignificant small pieces. The document was now being examined in its entirety by him. And as Guo went back and read it again, it was as if everyone and everything suddenly fell into place. The fragments that they discovered, including the letters 65, Dalo, Z, and Da, were not just random pieces of gibberish. These were snippets of street names and addresses that were scattered about. It turned out that the complete message that Guo was currently looking at was actually a comprehensive list of geographical directions. Furthermore, whomever was following them would be able to pinpoint the precise place on Highway 61 where Hua was killed by following these recommendations. Therefore, following this remarkable discovery, the authorities were able to figure out the complete tale of what transpired with Hua in a very short amount of time. They were finally able to identify the person who was responsible for her murder. However, unbelievably, the person responsible for the crime was not Hua's brother, despite the fact that this damning piece of evidence was discovered in his office. Instead, it would emerge out that the narrative of Hua's murder was far more terrible and much darker than anyone could have possibly imagined it to be. The event started 1 month before to Hua's passing away. It was at that time that 3 individuals, all of whom desired Hua's death, got together to devise a strategy. Hua's brother, Hua's ex-husband Shu, and the person who was the brains behind the entire operation were the 3 individuals in question. Within the context of this gathering, the 3 of them came to the conclusion that none of them desired to get their own hands dirty. Consequently, they would employ a hitman to carry out the act for them. They made the decision that once they had identified the appropriate individual, they would have Hua murdered at a location that was neutral. It was a particular location on the side of Highway 61 that they selected. They chose a date and time for her execution that would be convenient, a time when that portion of the road would be essentially deserted, and in an area where there were no security cameras and very few streetlights. In addition, they chose a location that would permit them to carry out the execution. The reason that her ex-husband Shu rode down the apartment elevator with her and held and kissed her in that peculiar, extended display of devotion was because he knew exactly what was going to happen to Hua on the night that she was due to be killed. This was the reason why he did all of these things. He was saying his last farewell to the world. Shu got in touch with Hua's brother after Hua had left the apartment complex and moved away in his vehicle. Following that, the brother called the assassin whom they had hired. After that, the assassin followed the directions that the brother had written down for him, which were the identical directions that Officer Guo had discovered in his office, in order to arrive at the prearranged site where they were going to assassinate Hua. Upon arriving at the location, the assassin simply parked his vehicle on the side of the road, turned off his lights, and waited for the assassin to arrive. A short while later, the assassin seen Hua's gray sedan go by him and then come to a controlled halt on the shoulder of the road, directly in front of where he was standing. Therefore, at this point, the assassin exited his vehicle and walked away. It was then that he approached Hua's vehicle. Her window had already been down. He drew a gun and fired a single shot at her, one that was aimed right below the ear. However, it would emerge out that Hua herself was the third person who met up with the ex-husband, and the brother, the person who wanted Hua to be killed, and the person who was the ultimate mastermind behind Hua's death. The fact why Hua had those directions in her car, which she eventually tore up and attempted to get rid of, was due to the fact that she required those directions in order to arrive at the location where she was going to be murdered. This is the reason why she remained so calm. This is the reason why she came to a stop so easily. Because of this, the assassin was able to approach her vehicle without any type of resistance and shoot her without any kind of resistance. In anticipation of his arrival, she had lowered the window and was waiting for him. After further investigation, the police discovered that Hua had purchased a substantial life insurance policy for herself. The amount of money it was worth was so high that it would have been enough to pay off all of her crushing debt while still leaving her family with a significant amount of money to continue living on. She had planned her own murder as a form of self-sacrifice that was both desperate and tragic, with the intention of providing a better life for her children and the guy whom she still loved. At the end of the day, she was successful in persuading her brother and her ex-husband to assist her with this scheme in exchange for a portion of the money from the insurance policy. It turned out that her scheme was unsuccessful in the end. The findings of the investigation lead the insurance company to conclude that Hua's death was a suicide rather than a homicide. As a consequence of this, they did not provide her family with even a single $1 in compensation. There were a number of significant allegations that were brought against Shu, Hua's brother, and the hitman that they hired. These charges included assisting suicide and paying insurance fraud. They each received terms that ranged from 6.5 to 7 years in prison for their respective offenses. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? Tonight, I have 2 great stories, but I couldn't figure out how to tease them like I do at the top of these episodes. I realized that what makes these stories special is that they're both great campfire stories. 2 teenage girls named Rachel and Molly lived in a quiet, rural New York in the late 1990s. Best friends, they were inseparable and part of a large high school group that spent a lot of time together. Still, Rachel and Molly had a special bond within that larger circle. 2 of them were often seen together, sharing secrets and navigating high school. Love of goth culture brought them together and bonded their group. High school goths had a distinct identity in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It meant wearing mostly black. Black nail polish, lipstick, and a deep black hair coloring. Celebrate all things dark and macabre. Others saw it as a philosophical exploration of life's darker side and a way to express their non-mainstream feelings. Many saw it as a fashion statement, a way to stand out and feel special. It was a distinct subculture in the late 1990s, and Rachel and Molly were fully committed to it. They liked the music, fashion, and atmosphere. A favorite hangout for Rachel, Molly, and their goth friends was the local cemetery. It was initially a joke, an ironic performance of their identity. Where else would the goth kids hang out than a cemetery? Their first few trips there were humorous because it felt too predictable. Odd thing happened. The cemetery was actually cool to hang out in. They were never bothered there in the peace. So it became their seat. It was their weekend hangout. The cemetery was usually visited at night by Rachel, Molly, and their friends. This maximized the dark, spooky atmosphere they were going for, leaning goth. A more important rule was that they always went together. Rachel and Molly were never alone. They always hung out with several of their friends. This had several causes. First, more people meant more energy and conversation, making it more fun. Though they loved it, the cemetery was creepy at night. Numbers provided safety. It felt less intimidating and more like their own park with a group. Rachel was home alone on a Friday night, bored, when the phone rang. Was Molly. Caller Molly was cheerful. Rachel replied immediately when she asked, "Hey, you want to go hang out in the cemetery?" "Duh," she said. They did it on weekends. "I'd love to go. Come pick me up." Rachel got ready after saying goodbye. It was her usual all-black outfit, makeup, and waiting outside for Molly's car. A few minutes later, Molly's headlights turned onto her street, and the car pulled up to the curb. Rachel saw Molly alone in the car first. It was odd. When they picked her up for cemetery nights, the car was usually full of friends. Rachel entered through the passenger door. While buckling her seatbelt, she asked Molly, "Hey, so where is everyone? Are we going to pick up the rest of the group now?" Molly dismissed her. "In fact, no," she said. "I tried calling everyone else, but they're all busy. Some are working, some are hungover from last night. It's just going to be us two at the cemetery. Is that okay?" Rachel had an uneasy feeling. Really, this was wrong. They did not do this. The cemetery hangout was about group dynamics and shared experience. Just one person made me feel more vulnerable. There was no problem with her closeness to Molly. Being in that big, dark cemetery without their friends made them uncomfortable. She looked over at Molly, who seemed to have accepted it. Rachel didn't want to be negative or crude. It seemed impossible to say no now. So she smiled and said, "Oh yeah, that's fine. It'll be great, just the two of us. Let's go." Despite her hesitation, she sat down and they drove the half-mile to the cemetery. The cemetery was massive. A massive, ancient burial ground stretched for miles. A massive, medieval-looking gate with a wrought iron archway spanned the entrance, greeted you as you approached. The archway made the gates look Gothic and imposing, even though they were always open. After passing that arch, a single road ran straight down the cemetery from front to back, probably over a mile. That road divided the grounds into two huge parts, the right and left. Molly, Rachel, and their friends frequented the back left corner. Terrain was their reason for choosing that area. Left of the cemetery were rolling hills where plots were laid out. That back left corner had a natural depression, a shallow bowl with few tombstones. At the bottom of this depression was a large boulder and tree. This place fit them. Standing at the main gate and scanning the vast cemetery, anyone sitting in that depressed area would be hidden. Teenagers wanted to be hidden, so they were. It was their secret hideout. So Rachel and Molly drove through the grand gate and down that long straight road to the cemetery's back. The sun had set and it was growing dark. Although it wasn't pitch black, the light was fading fast. Nobody was around, as usual. This time of night, the cemetery was usually empty. Local university students occasionally hopped the fence on the opposite side of the cemetery from them. They sometimes lit a bonfire against the fence on that side. Sometimes they sneaked over and did it, even though it was illegal. But that was unusual. Most of the cemetery was empty except for college students. They parked at the end of the road and exited. They descended the gentle grassy slope from the road into their usual gathering spot, the depression. At the bottom, they leaned back against the tree trunk on the big rock by their usual spots. They smoked cigarettes and talked as usual. Rural New York goth teens in the 1990s did this. They chatted about boyfriends, school drama, and stories. Light faded from the sky, making it completely dark. Girls still enjoyed themselves. Rachel was thinking this was kind of nice. Not as scary as she expected. It was calm and comfortable, and she was spending time with her best friend. They noticed a new smell after a while. Smoke smelled distinct. The bonfire spot across the cemetery was now remembered by both. Even though it was far away, college students could have started a fire. First, they glanced over that way and saw nothing, but they'd been hanging out for a while. While they were down there, those kids could have hopped the fence and started a fire. They weren't bothered by the fire. On the other side of the huge cemetery, it didn't affect their work. Rachel and Molly knew from past experience that the police always arrived at bonfires there. Predestined. They were kicked out after the police made the kids put out their fire. To ensure no one was around after hours, they always swept the cemetery. Even if they weren't starting fires, Molly and Rachel would be expelled. Rachel and Molly looked at each other as they smelled the smoke and agreed. Leave now before the police arrive and force them to. Additionally, they had been there for a while and were ready to leave. Their timeline accelerated slightly. It was fine. They extinguished their cigarettes, gathered their belongings, and walked back up the hill to the car. As they climbed the hill, they expected to see their car parked on the road. They hoped to see the tiny flicker of the bonfire they were smelling across the cemetery. They didn't see a fire on the cemetery's other side when they reached the hilltop. Instead, to their right, maybe 100 meters away, was another depression and rolling hill that dipped out of sight. They saw flickering flames from that direction. The fire started in the depression next to their cemetery, not across it. This was odd. This side of the cemetery was empty when they arrived. The place was empty. Someone had arrived while they were there and started a fire nearby. Never before had they seen this. It was strange. Nobody started fires here. What happened? Both girls wondered. They assumed the college students had tried a new place. They only saw the fire's tops rising from the ridgeline, not the people. The person over there probably didn't know they were here. They had an idea. Molly asked Rachel, "What if we go back down and sneak up the other side of our hill? We could poke our heads over and see who it is. We could spy on them." An exciting, slightly mischievous idea. Why not since they were here? Two girls agreed, turned around, and returned to depression. They climbed the hill opposite the mysterious fire, past the big rock and tree where they had been sitting for 2 hours. They moved quietly to hide. Rachel accidentally made noise as they approached the hilltop, where they could see the fire and whoever was there. In the quiet night, she stepped on a dry branch or loose rock, which cracked loudly. Fire crackling was the only sound. No one spoke from the other side. Rachel covered her mouth and stared at Molly. Molly asked, "What are you doing?" "We're trying to be quiet." Twin girls froze. They stood still, listening to see if the firemen heard them. It was silent. A spooky silence. The mood changed then. Something was off. Even though they hadn't reached the top of the hill or seen who was at the fire, their playful curiosity had turned into a cold dread. Both looked at each other and knew they were thinking the same thing. They agreed, maybe we should just turn around and leave. Yeah, let's get out of here. This doesn't feel right. As quietly as possible, the two girls turned around and returned to their depression. They quickly passed the rock and tree and returned up the hill to their car. Rachel glanced back over her shoulder at the hill they had just come from while walking. And what she saw chilled her. Man stood on ridgeline. The fire behind him silhouetted him, making him ominous against the orange glow. Standing still, he stared at them. Though silent, he watched them. It was him at the fire. The Rachel noise must have reached him. Molly turned and saw the man as Rachel frantically whispered, "Molly, look, look." She felt pure fear. "Let's get out of here," she panicked. "We don't know who that guy is." "We have to go now." They stopped, ran up the hill. Seconds later, Rachel glanced back. The hillman was gone. She thought he was gone, terrified. Then she saw movement in the darkness below. He ran down the hill toward them. Girl screamed. The grassy slope to the road was scrambled at full speed. The man was closing in, and Rachel kept looking back. He moved quickly. They ran to Molly's car after climbing the hill, their lungs burning. They fiddled with the doors, jumped inside, and slammed them shut, locking them. Molly started the engine, jumped out, and screeched tires on the asphalt. Rachel watched out the back window as they drove down the cemetery road. She saw him. Reaching the road, he was almost there. He paused as their car vanished into the night. After turning, he slowly descended the hill out of sight. Molly and Rachel were traumatized. Their hearts raced and they panted. That was no college student. That was a grown man, possibly in his 40s, unfamiliar to them. Everything felt creepy and dangerous. It baffled them. They kept asking, what would have happened if he caught us? What was he trying to do? What just happened? By the time Molly dropped Rachel off at her house, the terror had subsided and been replaced by cautious energy. They nearly laughed it off as a crazy night. Man, that was insane, huh? They told a wild story about a close call. They promised not to return alone at night. Rachel entered home. Never told her mom what happened. She put her things down, went to her room, and calmed down. Without telling anyone about their terrifying encounter, Molly did the same at home. They both went to bed to forget. The next morning, Rachel went downstairs to the kitchen. Mom was making coffee and going through her morning routine. She asked, "Hey, how was your night last night?" Rachel shrugged. "Oh, it was fine. Me and Molly went out." "No big deal." Her mother looked serious. Ripped her head. "Oh, did you hear what happened last night?" Her mother asked gravely. "No, what do you mean?" "What happened?" "Well, a woman in our town got kidnapped. She was taken from the parking garage where I park for work. She worked in the same building as me." Rachel's wide eyes. The mother of Rachel breathed deeply. "No. I mean, yes, they found her. But unfortunately, it was too late. When they found her, she was dead. And whoever kidnapped and killed her, they brought her body to the local cemetery last night. And they burned her in a huge bonfire." Her mom let the words sink in. "Whoever did it still hasn't been caught." Hearing this felt like the floor fell out from under Rachel. Her world fell apart. Now, everything from the night before made sense sickeningly. They smelled no college party bonfire. Mom mentioned that fire. A man chased them and was the killer. The murdered woman's body was likely in that fire. They were just 100 meters from a killer dumping his victim's body. Scary thought. They likely witnessed the killer set the fire and start this horrific act. What if that man caught them? Were they to continue spying on him over the hill without Rachel's noise, what would he have done to them? Rachel broke down and told her mom everything from the night before. Horror struck her mother. Rachel called Molly immediately to tell her what she had learned. Caller Molly went hysterical. They realized how close they were to disaster. They presented their case to the police. They best described the man, but it wasn't much. They feared the dark. All they knew was that he was average-sized and probably in his 40s. It wasn't specific. Fortunately, police caught the killer 48 hours later. Not because of the girl's description, but luck. Police saw the victim's car driving around town. Car stopped, and the driver was the killer. After arrest, he confessed. Not surprisingly, Rachel and Molly never saw that cemetery the same. They feel lucky when they think about that night. Rachel's accidental noise as they approached the fire may have saved them. One accidental sound made them pause, reconsider, and turn around to leave. That saved them because if they had crested that hill and met the killer, they may have both died in that bonfire. I served in the military before starting this channel and telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories online. 7 years as Navy SEAL. I thought that was my life's purpose and career. Getting hurt made it not the right fit for me in the long run. The rest is history after I left the service. My military experience includes many funny stories about our brutal training and some scary stories about my overseas service. Experiencing my first deployment to Afghanistan has always stood out to me as a special memory. That it's not a war story helps it stand out. The Navy SEAL training took almost 3 years of my life. An arduous process. I finally arrived. SEAL Team 2 in Virginia was my East Coast assignment. We immediately started training for our first deployment and learned we were going to Afghanistan. This was in 2013, when going to Afghanistan meant fighting. There were active combat operations nationwide. Navy SEALs and other direct combat units want war. You've spent years training for it, not because you're a warmonger or love violence. You want to prove yourself and do your best after all your hard work. Thus, I was preparing for battle. It was deployment day. In a typical SEALs flight, the team isn't sent out together. It's unsafe. That plane crash could kill a platoon. You're sent out in small batches, sometimes on civilian flights for the first leg. I flew to South America with 2 other SEALs dressed as civilians. From there, we took a military transit flight into Afghanistan. I was focused throughout. The end. I've prepared for this. Here goes. The last leg of the trip, the flight into Afghanistan, was on that military plane. The military pilots made 2 changes when we entered active war zone Afghan airspace. A dark red replaced the aircraft's white overhead lights. They then told us to avoid windows over the intercom. We were approaching the most dangerous part of the flight, landing. You didn't want to sit next to a window if the plane was shot at from the ground. It wouldn't matter where you were sitting if the plane was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade, but it was a stark reminder that we were about to enter a war zone. Also intense was landing these large transport planes in combat zones. They needed to minimize ground-level small arms fire at them. Lower people are more vulnerable. They would land combatively. They would dive straight down toward the runway and pull up at the last second to land abruptly. It was rough. We were on this crazy landing, red lights glowing, everyone tucked away from the windows, and my mind kept repeating, "Okay, we're ready for Afghanistan." Fob Shank is a well-fortified base where we landed safely. The massive ramp at the back of the plane lowered after taxiing. Since my gear had been shipped on pallets weeks earlier, I grabbed my pack. I had only my backpack. I and a teammate walked down the ramp onto the tarmac. We existed. First sighting of Afghanistan. I didn't see the country the first time because the plane windows were tiny portholes and we were told to avoid them. Honestly, standing there and looking around was breathtaking. Afghanistan's beauty is astounding. These massive snow-covered mountains and beautiful wide-open fields surrounded us 360 degrees. The land appeared unspoiled. The jagged scar on the earth was the NATO base, where war was launched. Contrast was striking. I didn't understand. This place was too beautiful to fight. That feeling did not last. We were quickly led to a holding area, grabbed our gear, and loaded into MRAPs or heavily armored military vehicles. These are IED-resistant 50-ton beasts. We drove from that big base to a smaller, more remote, forward operating base in the sticks. It was more vulnerable, and we would operate there for 6 months. Our new home arrived late that night. This primitive outpost was in the middle of nowhere. When we arrived, the SEAL team we were replacing was finishing their deployment. There were interpreters, who are crucial to the war effort. These interpreters were mostly 20-somethings who had worked on these bases with American units for years. They couldn't leave the base because they worked with NATO. As traitors, the Taliban and other militant groups targeted them. These interpreters believed that working with NATO would allow them to leave Afghanistan and immigrate to the US. Some fulfilled that promise. And these guys were tough. They fought more than most soldiers. They witnessed some incredible events. I met our partner force and interpreters right away because my platoon role involved working closely with them. SEAL Team 8, already there, was crazy. There had been 6 months of fighting. These huge men with massive beards seemed unconcerned about everything. My first night, I was super green. I met with one of our interpreters to learn the scope and expectations. We discussed possible operations and got to know each other. This 25 or 26-year-old interpreter leaned in and said, "Bro, and they all used American slang they picked up from being around young soldiers and Marines all day. He asked, "Bro, have you heard the story of what was in the cave in Kandahar? We were in a different province." I soon learned that local interpreters and soldiers had a persistent, almost legendary story about a giant, big humanoid creature that lived in a cave in Kandahar's mountains. Afghanistan has endless mountains and caves. Humans have probably never explored many of these caves in remote areas. Indeed, this interpreter was serious. He declared, "Bro, I'm telling you, it's real. There was a giant up in the caves in Kandahar. Have you heard about this?" He seemed curious and wanted to know more. It planted a seed in my mind without further discussion that night. This interpreter, who had seen real combat and was not prone to fantasy, believed this weird story. The idea stuck. Many years later, I'm out of the military and writing strange, dark, and mysterious stories online. At the start of the channel, I was thinking about what stories to tell, and remembered the Kandahar giant. It seemed like a good idea to investigate what my interpreter was saying. I found this treasure trove of testimony from a specific group of Green Berets, a special forces team that had a very real and very strange encounter in Kandahar caves. One soldier, anonymously known as Mr. K, due to fear of repercussions for speaking out, gave shocking testimony about what they saw. I wanted to compile all the notes and tell my interpreter's story from years ago. I'll repeat that story tonight. An Army infantry unit patrolled Kandahar in 2002. Imagine huge, snow-covered peaks and deep valleys. In 2002, these patrols searched for Taliban hideouts and cave systems or enemy fighters in valleys below. These patrols were routine. Soldiers, regardless of branch, update their superiors while on patrol. Routine or not, most operations are planned. Everything is planned: when you arrive, how long you'll stay, your goals, when you leave, and how you'll leave. It's organized. This infantry unit patrolled routinely. However, their higher command lost contact with them mid-mission. A red flag was raised immediately. A unit's communications were sometimes lost. It's hard to send radio signals across huge mountain ranges with imperfect equipment. Usually, lost communications are recovered quickly. A long time passed without this unit's response. As the higher command debated whether to send a quick reaction force or air assets to find them, something even more alarming was noted. The unit went silent without calling a tick first. A tick troops in contact indicates a gunfight. This step is crucial. If you're shot, your command doesn't know. Call it in. A support system activates when you do. Air support, medical evacuation, and reinforcements may be needed. Someone on the ground yells tick, tick, tick into the radio when a firefight begins. Everyone is on alert to help. Soldiers call in ticks too quickly because they're like cheat codes for overwhelming support. An engagement of this magnitude rarely goes unreported. To have an entire unit go silent without calling in a tick was strange. It meant it was either a massive, unprecedented radio failure or something else that didn't fit combat patterns. After a while, the Army decided to send an elite unit to find the unit. The mission was given to the Army's top special forces, the Green Berets. Mr. K was in that Green Beret detachment. Mr. K's small team of Green Berets took helicopters to the remote Kandahar area where the infantry unit was last seen. The landing was as rural as it gets. Only the occasional mud hut existed. That mountain range was vast and empty. It can feel like another planet. There was nothing to see. All around was a wasteland, no locals or Americans. People knew the search area was huge and the terrain was rough. Hiking through the mountains to find the missing soldiers would be difficult for several days. Each carried a heavy pack of ammo, water, and gear. They hiked the missing unit's rough route. Hiking through the mountains yielded nothing. For several days, they hiked all day. They had a few distant enemy encounters, but nothing major. They were searching for missing soldiers, not fighting. Hiking, they searched the landscape for clues. Days went by with no results. On their fourth day of searching, Mr. K and his team saw a goat trail ahead while walking through a mountain range. The narrow path climbed and crossed the mountain. So they took it. No intelligence led them there, but it was a trail which was easier to walk on than the rocky terrain they had been navigating. They thought they'd follow it across, get a better view, and spot something in the next valley. Therefore, Mr. K and the Green Berets started up the winding goat trail. As they walked, they saw plastic and metal fragments on the path. They were initially unidentified. While climbing, they realized these were military equipment fragments. Radios and other equipment from an American infantry unit were included. Their senses were primed. The men had rifles ready, including Mr. K. They climbed the trail more cautiously, knowing they were on the right track, but that they could face danger. On top of this mountain, what would they find? Bloody ambush grounds? Surviving unit members? Unaware. Evidence increased as they hiked. Large radios and military backpacks were found. They found uniforms with name tags and unit patches. They now knew the uniforms belonged to the unit they were looking for. They had found their first real lead, and it looked bad. They reached Trail's peak. Green Berets are the world's best trained soldiers. Regardless of how bizarre, their training would take over. They would have moved precisely and confidently, ready for anything. After climbing the trail, Mr. K and his team reached a flat plateau. 3 massive cave entrances opened up onto the plateau like front porch doors as the mountain rose above it. More military equipment was scattered on this plateau, but this time it was different. Some bones were human. Human bones were scattered. No one was here. If the missing unit were here, something terrible had happened to them. Green Berets set up defensive positions around the plateau immediately. It was imperative to clear those caves. Inside were survivors? The perpetrators were inside? To investigate, Mr. K and his shooting partner had to approach a cave entrance. The team supplied cover and watched all angles as they crossed the plateau silently. Mr. K entered with his partner. A huge opening could be walked into, but it was dark inside. It took a few steps into the cave for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. Trying to spot anything, he noticed a sheer drop inside the entrance. Cave floors fell into deep pits. Though he stopped in time, he couldn't see the bottom in the darkness. As he stood up, he saw movement in the cave's back, across the deep crevasse. On instinct, Mr. K raised his rifle to shoot. He was stopped by a huge spear, like a javelin, flying out of the darkness. Impaling his partner, Soldier Dan, sent him flying backward out of the cave entrance. The team witnessed it. A huge humanoid creature bounded out of the cave in seconds. It was 12 feet tall, with fiery red hair and beard. It wore animal skins and had 6 fingers and toes on each hand and foot. It jumped the crevasse and stormed the plateau. The Green Berets fired upon it as it ran out, likely to attack the team. In seconds, a hail of bullets killed the massive creature. What happened was beyond anyone's comprehension, but their training kicked in again. Then they rushed to Dan to treat him after the threat was gone and the caves were empty. Too late. He left. The team faced an impossible situation. They had killed a 12-foot giant, lost a man, and hadn't found the missing unit. Team leader called higher command on radio. He responded with, "You have to come get us. I can't even tell you what just happened, but we have a man down, and we have this combatant. You need to get out here, and you need to take this thing too." 2 helicopters soon followed. One was returning the Green Berets and Dan's body to base. Another helicopter's cargo net was huge. They carried the dead giant in the net, attached it to the helicopter's underside, and flew away. Standard procedure for Mr. K and his team was to return to base and debrief the mission. Your after-action report details what happened. Upon returning, something was different. They received no visitors. Just record what they saw and leave it. So did they. They recorded the giant attack. But higher command told them they couldn't include those details in their report. They were told to alter. They were told, "We can't say you fought a giant in a cave." Change the report. Despite knowing it was a lie, they rewrote the report to say they encountered a normal threat who killed Dan with small arms fire. They had to sign non-disclosure agreements to keep quiet about what they saw in the cave after submitting the false report. After that, they were told to forget. When they tried to find more information, all official reports about that operation were heavily redacted or classified. No one told Mr. K what happened to the missing infantry unit. It was all a black hole mystery. In 2016, 14 years have passed. K decided to reveal the truth. He thought it was wrong to hide what happened and how his friend Dan died. They agreed after talking to his teammates. He told his story because of that. When he did, he found other military personnel had seen the giant. At the airfield where the giant's body was brought, pilots saw a 12 to 15-foot tall creature with 6 fingers and 6 toes loaded onto a transport plane. They were told to never mention it and to remove it from their reports. Everyone who encountered this creature was sworn to secrecy, and the government tried to hide it. The story confuses me. Some part of me wants to trust Mr. K and others. I remember my grounded interpreter in Afghanistan believing something strange was living in those caves. Perhaps possible. You feel like anything could be hidden in those mountains in that ancient alien landscape. With an infantry unit still missing and a Green Beret who was killed in action, his team wants the truth about his death told. Government concealment seems obvious. They may be hiding something, but this story seems to have more to it. Much obliged for watching. Leave a comment on today's episode. We have a whole playlist of true crime episodes to binge from. Next time. Farewell. A woman called a moving company in New York and suddenly realized something was terribly wrong. The employee who answered the phone told her that her 8-year-old daughter, Eliza, never showed up for work that day. At first, the woman said nothing. Then her breathing changed. Her voice started trembling. And before hanging up, she quietly said she needed to call 911 immediately. Just moments earlier, she had walked into her house and found the entire place destroyed. Furniture overturned. Papers scattered everywhere. And upstairs, behind a locked bedroom door, was something waiting that would horrify detectives for months to come. That night, the 10th of August 2005, investigators in New York began looking into what appeared to be a violent home invasion But as the evidence started coming together, they realized the killer wasn't a stranger who broke into the house. The killer was someone who had already been standing beside the family the entire time. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button. You'll save them a seat at the movies, but then you put your code on it instead. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early afternoon of Wednesday, the 10th of August, 2005, 8-year-old Eliza Parsi was sitting on her bed in her Staten Island home, flipping through a fashion magazine. The house was quiet. Her mother, Seema, was at work, so Eliza had the place to herself until her own shift started later. Eliza had just graduated high school a few months earlier and was working as a clerk at a moving company. She was saving up for college, but her real dream was to move into Manhattan and work in the fashion industry. Still, she felt a little guilty about leaving. It would mean her mom would be all alone in the big house. Eliza's parents, who were both from Israel, had divorced about a year and a half before. Her father had moved back to Israel, leaving just her and her mom in New York. Eliza did have 2 older half-brothers from her mom's first marriage. One was also in Israel. The other, her 2 7-year-old half-brother Raviv, lived a short drive away. But they rarely saw him. Raviv was married with a new baby and was in charge of the family's struggling kosher cookie business. He was always busy, always stressed about money, and just didn't make it out to Staten Island much. Eliza got to the last page of her magazine and saw it was time to get ready for her 2 p.m. shift. But first, she wanted to check her messages on her online dating profiles. So she went over to her desk and logged into her computer. Back in 2005, internet dating was just taking off, and Eliza had made a few profiles to see what would happen. She'd started messaging and meeting up with men from all over the city, but she kept it a secret from her mother. She knew Seema wouldn't approve of her dating men who weren't from their Orthodox Jewish faith. Eliza knew this for a fact because it had happened with her last boyfriend, Hassan. He was a Muslim boy she'd met at her public high school. Her family had completely disapproved of the relationship because of his religion. The pressure became too much, and Eliza eventually broke up with him. So now, she was much more secretive. She'd make up excuses to go to other neighborhoods when really she was going on dates. She had even started secretly bringing some of the guys back to her house, always sneaking them in through the back door when her mom was at work. Eliza saw a few new messages and replied to them. Then she headed into the bathroom to take a shower. A few minutes later, she turned off the water and heard a noise from outside the bathroom. She'd heard a landscaping crew next door earlier, but this was different. It was a weird banging sound. Thinking it might just be the landscapers next door, Eliza stepped out of the shower and wrapped a towel tightly around herself. Then, she slowly opened the bathroom door to see where the noise was coming from. But someone was already inside the house. That night, around 7:30 p.m., Eliza's mother, Seema, got home. She put her key in the front door, but it would only open a few inches. Something was blocking it. Confused, Seema shoved against the door until she could squeeze inside. The first thing she saw was that a heavy mirror had been propped against the door. Before she could process why, she turned on the lights and saw her living room was completely destroyed. Furniture was overturned, cabinets were open, and papers were everywhere. Seema immediately felt her heart start pounding. Someone had broken into the house. But then another thought hit her. Where was Eliza? Seema knew her daughter had been home. She started calling out her name, but there was no answer. She ran upstairs and saw that the door to Eliza's room was closed. She tried the handle, but it was locked. This was wrong. Eliza never locked her door. In a panic, Seema banged on the door, screaming Eliza's name. But there was only silence. She pulled out her phone and called the moving company. When Eliza's boss told her she'd never shown up for work, Sema's stomach dropped. With trembling hands, she hung up and dialed 911. About an hour later, Detective Michael Kenny of the NYPD arrived. The street was swarming with neighbors, and yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the front yard. He parked and walked to the house, where two patrol officers met him. They told him they'd responded to a robbery call, had to break down a locked bedroom door, and inside, they found the body of one 8-year-old Eliza Parsi. The officers said the whole house was torn apart, but they couldn't find any sign of a forced entry. They pointed to Sema, who was standing nearby with a young man. Kenny knew he'd have to talk to her, but first, he needed to see the scene for himself. Inside, the living room was a mess, but Kenny noticed that valuable items like the TV and stereo were sitting out in the open, untouched. That was unusual for a burglary. He went upstairs to Eliza's room. It was also ransacked. Clothes were everywhere, and the mattress was pulled off the bed, leaning against a wall. In the middle of the floor was Eliza's body. She was naked, with a towel bunched up underneath her. Kenny asked a crime scene tech if this was how they found her. The tech said no. When they first arrived, Eliza had been underneath the mattress with a pillow over her face. They had to move both to examine her. Kenny knelt down but couldn't see an obvious cause of death, no bullet or knife wounds. This suggested she might have been suffocated, maybe with that pillow. He asked if they'd found any signs of injury. The tech pointed to a few tiny drops of blood on the towel. They were small and could have been old. But all the details, a naked young woman, the mattress, the pillow, the blood, made Kenny suspect she had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. He told the tech to collect the blood and any other fluids as evidence. A few minutes later, Kenny went outside to speak with Sema. She was crying on the shoulder of a young man who immediately stepped forward when he saw Kenny. He demanded to know why they couldn't see Eliza and why the police weren't out arresting her killer. Kenny took a deep breath. This was clearly Eliza's brother, and his anger was understandable. Kenny calmly explained that to find the killer, he needed information, starting with where he and Sema had been that day. The man lowered his voice and introduced himself as Raviv. He and Sema both said they had been at work all day and had alibis. Kenny then asked if they knew anyone who would want to harm Eliza. He saw them exchange a knowing glance. Raviv immediately said Kenny should look into her ex-boyfriend Hassan. Sema added that just a few weeks ago, Eliza had woken up to find Hassan sitting at the end of her bed, just staring at her. She said it terrified Eliza, who had no idea how he'd gotten inside. Before Kenny could ask another question, Raviv suddenly started yelling at someone across the yard. "Get out! We don't want you here!" Kenny turned and saw a teenage boy standing there, looking scared. Raviv then turned back to Kenny and yelled at him to arrest that boy, Hassan, because he was the one who killed Eliza. Late that night, Detective Kenny sat in an interrogation room with Hassan. So far, Hassan had been cooperative, but he didn't have a solid alibi for the time Eliza was likely killed. Kenny had taken a DNA sample from him, as well as from Sema and Raviv, to compare against the evidence found at the scene. But DNA results took weeks back in 2005, so Kenny hoped for a confession. He asked Hassan if he had ever snuck into Eliza's house. Hassan didn't deny it. He admitted he had, but insisted he was just trying to talk to her to get back together. He said Eliza wasn't terrified, just annoyed, and told him to leave. Kenny noted the difference between Hassan's story and Sema's. He asked why Eliza's family disliked him so much. Hassan hung his head and said it was about religion. He was Muslim and they were Orthodox Jewish. Kenny wasn't sure what to believe. Was Hassan an obsessive ex-boyfriend, or were they just star-crossed lovers? Either way, he had a motive and a history of sneaking into her house. But with no confession and no hard evidence, Kenny had to let him go. The next day was Eliza's funeral, held so quickly due to Orthodox custom. Kenny had just received the autopsy report. It confirmed Eliza died from asphyxiation, likely smothered by the pillow. The medical examiner also found semen showing she'd had sex within 24 hours of her death and skin cells under her fingernails suggesting she fought back. But here was the twist. The report concluded the sex had been consensual. There were no signs of sexual violence. This meant the killer was likely a romantic partner, which seemed to clear her family. But it also didn't seem to be a random burglar since nothing was stolen. At the synagogue, Kenny saw two groups, members of the Orthodox community and Eliza's friends from school. He stood in the back of the men's section and watched. The atmosphere was solemn. Then, suddenly, the energy in the room shifted. Everyone turned to look at the entrance. It was Hassan. He was trying to make his way to the casket. Raviv saw him, marched straight over, shoved him, and yelled at him to get out. Before a fight could break out, other men separated them and escorted Hassan out of the building. 2 weeks later, on August 24th, Kenny was with the NYPD computer crime unit. Eliza's friends had told him about her secret online dating life. The IT specialists dug into her computer and found a message thread with a man named Jonathan. They were making plans to meet at her house for sex on August 9th, the day before she was killed. Eliza told him to come to her house while her mom was at work and that she'd leave the back door unlocked so he could sneak in. This plan matched the crime scene perfectly. Kenny tracked Jonathan down. He admitted he'd gone to her house and they'd had consensual sex, but he insisted he never went back to Staten Island after that. He gave a DNA sample without hesitation. Weeks passed and the case went cold. Kenny had nothing solid on Hassan or Jonathan. Then, on September 13th, the medical examiner called. The DNA results were in. The semen sample didn't match the skin cells under Eliza's fingernails. There was DNA from two different men. The semen belonged to Jonathan, confirming his story of consensual sex the day before. The skin cells found under Eliza's fingernails from her desperate fight for her life belonged to her half-brother, Raviv. Raviv was angry at his mother. The family cookie business she'd passed to him was failing, and he felt humiliated living in his in-laws' basement with his wife and new baby. He knew Seema had money from her recent divorce, money he felt was rightfully his. So on August 10th, instead of driving his delivery route, he went to his mother's house to steal it. He didn't know Eliza's work schedule had changed and that she would be home. Before searching the house, Raviv dragged a heavy mirror in front of the front door, creating a barricade in case someone unexpectedly came home. When he went into Eliza's room, he was shocked to find her coming out of the bathroom. He knew she would tell their mother what he was doing. In a panic, he tackled her, smothered her with a pillow until she stopped fighting, and then staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. He then left, only to return hours later after his mother called him, pretending to be a grieving brother. Raviv eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. In the end, the person demanding justice the loudest outside the crime scene was the same person who had killed Eliza only hours earlier. Raviv had publicly blamed Hassan, comforted his grieving mother, and stood beside detectives pretending to mourn his sister. But the entire time, the killer had already been there. Hours earlier, when Seema called Eliza's workplace searching for her daughter, Eliza was already dead inside the house. And the person she should have been safest around turned out to be the one she needed protection from most. Thanks for listening. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments below. If you want to watch more true crime stories, check out the playlist linked on screen. Until next time.